Hi, I'm Rachel and welcome to my Hanukkah 2025/5786 video. In these videos, I light each Hanukkah night candle with you and read from a collection of Jewish short stories. And this year I'm going to be reading from Loss of Memory is Only Temporary by Joanna Kaplan, this short story collection. So here we are on night one of Hanukkah. I've actually just returned from a concert where I already sang and technically lit the first candle at the local JCC. I just joined a new emerging choral group, Jewish choral group in Washington, D.C., and this was our first concert, and it went off really well. And frankly, given recent news, especially an attack abroad at a Hanukkah event, it was powerful to celebrate with the community. So anyway, that's how I'll segue into this, maybe in part because I wanted to start on a more positive note. The first story I read in here is called Other People's Lives, and actually it is a novella, not a short story at all. And the premise is that this young woman, Louisa, has actually just gotten out of a mental institution, and she's come to live in the home of a dying dancer, although I think he's not necessarily there, and his sort of embittered German wife and their young son. And the crux of all of the action that takes place in this 100 pages is mostly Louisa spying in on their lives as they meet with people, and the majority of the action is just dialogue of people talking without a lot of other context or sort of that richer interior nuance or grasping onto sort of plotty story. So I found it a difficult transition into this collection, which is actually rebound together. This is a relatively new edition, but a lot of Kaplan's stories come more from like the 70s, I believe, although she, I believe, is still active. But anyway, Francine Prose wrote a prologue to this book, and, I'm still hoping for good things, in terms of grasping onto some language, and I definitely felt it in here was definitely intriguing on its own, but that's not enough for me on its own. I'm really hoping for more story, and hopefully I'll be able to grasp that more in the smaller pieces. We shall see. It is night 2 of Hanukkah, and I am back to Loss of Memory is Only Temporary by Joanna Kaplan, and the first official short story in here, which is Sickness. And it's a little bit of a rocky start for me. This is also kind of flittery. We're following a character named Miriam who is sick, and occasionally she's in her head in her apartment, I think in the New York area. But sometimes she's going on these grand adventures to parts of Jewish history, following specific Jewish doctors from the Ottoman Empire, or following a community that's dealing with the czar's snatchers coming to snatch up Jewish young men to, forcibly inscript them in the army. Or sometimes her mind is, flying away with fellow neighbors and that sort of thing and getting into their head. So it's very kind of, not stream of consciousness, but, it's not something that's just linear and like staying once again with a insular main character going through things. I mean, other than, the sickness itself is, I think, the literary conceit that's supposed to be interesting to follow. But I just can't really, I have difficulty grasping on to this type of narrative. I just would like something, a little more traditional about following a story. So I don't know, maybe I won't be getting that in this collection, and if that's the case, hopefully I will be getting more familiar and more comfortable with these sorts of stories. At least this one was, more contained because it was shorter. It is night 3 of Hanukkah, and I'm back to the short story collection Loss of Memory is Only Temporary by Joanna Kaplan. This night I read a long short story, the title being Sour or Suntanned, It Makes No Difference. And like the others, I had a little trouble, but then I tried to go back to reread it to find a little more context. I liked it a little more the second time, but generally the setting is we are with this miserable, cynical teenage girl, Miriam. She is at a Jewish summer camp. We know it's the 1950s due to some fleeting historical references. And she's approached near the end of camp to be part of a play for Parents' Day because she looks so miserable. And this fits the contours of the play, which is really about the suffering of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising during the Holocaust. I mean, there's really no other point to the play. She plays a dead body for most of it, and a lot of people who come to Parents' Day, she doesn't know, but we might be able to understand are Holocaust survivors who come as well to sort of witness this. But she isn't getting any of this context or understanding it, although there are some references to the relationship between her aunt and her mother, and they come from Poland, having to do with sort of the trauma of that. But Miriam doesn't understand it. And doesn't really identify with it. And maybe it's commentary in a way on how the generation of the Holocaust wasn't really speaking about their experiences. So, and passing them on to the next generation, other than sending them to this camp that's, Zionist in terms of, there's a lot of Israeli influence. So, like, that's the future. This is us living on through Israeli counselors and Israeli dance and Israeli music and etc., which Miriam isn't identifying with. Mostly she's like, oh, I'm just a city girl who is out of place in the country, just with a bunch of other city Jews out in the country, and I'm miserable here. And the way that Kaplan continues to tell these stories, this is a character who, has insular thoughts, but she doesn't really ground in a lot of that. A lot of that is just sort of fleeting frustrations and focus on, a lot of the external environs to get the points across. So I feel like there's still a difficult bar of entry to reading this story. It's, I think, a writing style that I'm continuing to struggle with, but, I can tell that she's saying some pertinent mid-century Jewish and certainly American Jewish messaging in here. And I think it is supposed to be kind of caustic and funny, but humor, it can be difficult to, it can be difficult to, for me to grasp onto in fiction. I think I've talked about that in other videos this year. But anyway, it is night 4 of Hanukkah, and I'm back with Loss of Memory is Only Temporary by Joanna Kaplan, and a very different sort of short story this night, which is Dragon Lady. We are taking a step away from predominantly Jewish culture in New York, and this story has to do with a Chinese national Vietnamese citizen. And Kaplan is following a gimmick here, or maybe a writing exercise is more, nice, because the story starts with what I assume might be a real newspaper article, and it is about the capture of a woman who is this Chinese national Vietnamese citizen who, for political reasons, is, committing crimes and violent crimes. And then this story is about giving this person a backstory, and she even, takes quotes from the article as little headers throughout this shorter than usual story. And so we go into a little bit of depth about this sort of outsider character, but we're talking about very different culture, very different part of the world. It's also, I think, less wry and humorous than the other stories, so it's just a little bit different and a change of pace. And maybe for Kaplan, this was, trying something new to see if she could do it. So, that's intriguing in and of itself as well. So, yeah, I mean, we're about halfway through the collection, I guess. So, it's an interesting time for, a change. It is night 5 of Hanukkah. I'm back to the short story collection, Loss of Memory is Only Temporary by Joanna Kaplan. And we are up to the story Babysitting, not sitting. And back to the formula here of following, I'm pretty sure, supposed to be mid-century kind of caustic narrator, maybe who's, well, I guess in the throes of growing up as some sort of teenager who attends a school in New York, and it's a time when you could throw around a term like socialist Zionism a little easier than, comes today. And so this is part of her, the mindset that she's in about standing up against sort of the bourgeois and standing up against, what's considered to be normal and standard, and there's just a lot of sort of cynicism in her worldview among, like, in how, the story talks about her relationships with her friends and with her community. And she's brought to a guidance counselor for some sort of guidance, and in a way to sort of connect more with the broader world, they suggest she does some babysitting for actually a writer, one of the only writers apparently that she can stand. It's a poet named Ted Marshank, and it's about her getting disillusioned with him too, because she goes all the way out to Manhattan for this, which, technically speaking, it's supposed to be, nice, glitzy, sort of upper class existence, but it seems like Ted and his family are living like in a hovel, and just their life with their kids is just really underwhelming. And so she goes to babysit the kids a couple times, and she eavesdrops on letters, and she just finds his life, other than his wife, who kind of appears to be glamorous, his life is underwhelming, and she just sort of caustically like snipes about it. And it's, I guess, one of those teenage affectations, I guess it's supposed to be, that even your heroes disappoint you and don't live up to the ideals in your head. It's amusing, I suppose, but I still wish there were a little more meat on the bone, I guess, of this story, or maybe it's just that, this narrator and this style still isn't working for me, but, we still got a couple of nights left. It is night 6 of Hanukkah, and we have arrived at the titular story of Loss of Memory is Only Temporary, a short story collection by Joanna Kaplan. And in this story, we are following a woman named Naomi and her aunt, who comes to visit her at the hospital where she works as a psychiatrist, and she takes her to lunch at the hospital cafeteria, but it's not, I guess, unsurprisingly for this collection, a happy lunch. It's about snarking people snarking at each other. And in this case, the aunt definitely comes off as the villain of the piece, which for me is hard to read, about aunts being horrible to their nieces. But in their backstory, they have a lot of tragedy, that Naomi's father committed suicide and her brother's on a bad path. And her aunt has come here to basically shame her for, not being a good member of the family, or she shames her education as a doctor. And, she expresses maybe what could be legitimate fears about electroshock therapy, which Naomi's about to take part in. And that's where the title comes in, that the loss of memory is only temporary. And Naomi's trying to explain that, things have improved. I guess this is in the 70s, but things have improved since the scary stories that the aunt is telling about everything from her neighbors in the Bronx to, old Jewish wives' tales from the Pale Settlement, that sort of thing. But this woman just is really hateful, and it's hateful, but it's in that caustic, bitchy way that I think is supposed to be amusing to read. But certainly for me as an aunt, I'm like, ugh, I hate this woman for how she's treating her niece. And meanwhile, throughout the cafeteria meal, other doctors and so forth are coming up to Naomi, so that we can tell, even though we're technically, I think, in the aunt's head, that Naomi is the person who is the more evolved person of the two, and that's supposed to be the takeaway. It is night 7 of Hanukkah, and we are stepping into new territory in Loss of Memory is Only Temporary by Joanna Kaplan. This is ostensibly a short story collection, but now we're moving into what I believe is an essay that I think she even penned the year I was born, which is pretty cool. And this one is called Tales of My Great-Grandfathers. It has this framing device that I guess beginning, I should say, that doesn't necessarily fit the rest of it, where, like, a friend asks her, like, they're both Jewish, but Kaplan has been more, actively Jewish throughout her life, and the friend is asking her for ways to maybe, have an in into the community. And what Kaplan goes to about, her, I guess, genesis of feeling Jewish is about, the ethnicity of it, that, she has a strong family background in it, which doesn't necessarily answer the question about how to return to Jewish life. But anyway, it is a really intriguing stories that she writes about her two great-grandfathers. It almost feels like, a parable, because her two great-grandfathers had very different Jewish experiences. One was a renowned rabbi, and another one was ripped away from his family by the Russian Empire, in one of their forcible attempts to, conscript Jewish boys into the army to, make them non-Jews. That's basically the idea of that. But that, despite all odds and like a really long conscription period, that great-grandfather ultimately was able to return to the faith, which kind of makes him more impressive, I think, than the renowned rabbi, who actually, I think she kind of shows he's a more complex character than, like, even though he's seen as, and he was this person who cared a lot about the poor, but also I think that, he had to take from the community to do that as well. So that's interesting in and of itself. And I admit part of the reason I was drawn to this is because her family, is from the Minsk, Belarus area and from Lithuania, and that's actually where my Jewish background is as well, although I don't know as much about my family. But I find this, endearing to read about, and the style is a lot more straightforward in this essay than her short stories are, so I'm finding it a lot more approachable and easier to engage with. So I guess it might be my favorite piece so far in this, but it isn't a short story technically, so it's not my favorite short story, but this was a treat to read. It is the 8th and final night of Hanukkah, and I'm here to talk about the final story in this collection, Loss of Memory is Only Temporary by Joanna Kaplan. I actually read a review, maybe on Hadassah, that said that this last story, which was also the most recent to be published, I should say, called Family Obligations, is actually another essay. I'm not sure that's true, or it's probably more in the auto-fiction part of the spectrum, because it deals with, hyper-specific points of dialogue and a lot of some interior feelings that I think, would be something that would be more fictionalized than remembered. But that's just my take. But anyway, it is following, we can tell, another member of Kaplan's family. She had a great aunt who mid-century left the Pale of Settlement and went to Palestine and became a nurse in the Hula Valley, where they were draining the swamps. The story actually starts with the aunt going through war-torn Europe and dealing and treating sort of superstitious Jewish communities and overlooked by very anti-Semitic, dismissive Cossacks, talking about, the Bolshevik Revolution and how the Jews weren't doing their part, that sort of thing. And then we do jump a little into her time in the Hula Valley. And then a lot of the story, coming back to the family obligations theme, is about her visiting her family in the Bronx. And one of the child characters, I think, is based off of Joanna Kaplan, but has a different name. So another autofiction, perhaps, element to this. But it's really does veer away from the aunt to a certain degree to talk about the relationship between Joanna Kaplan's doppelganger and her mother, and the differences just in how they perceive the world, because Kaplan is a first-generation American and her mother is very aware of being an immigrant and what life was like and the poverty of life in Eastern Europe. And then the aunt comes and kind of gives a perspective of being a little bit removed from it all and being sort of maybe a refuge in a little bit of a way to this young girl, just for being a little bit different. And so, yeah, it is chock full of lots of Jewish references, definitely told more in the style of the fiction, where things aren't straightforward and it's just sort of streams of descriptions and dialogue that are going on in here. But certainly the Jewish content is what got me the most, kept me the most invested in this story and in most of the collection, which otherwise, in terms of the writing, I didn't jive with as much. Although I do admit that in the last few days I have in my head gone back a little bit to the short story Sour or Suntanned, It Makes No Difference, which is about a young teenager at a Zionist youth camp putting on a play about the Warsaw Ghetto when her, family wouldn't talk about it, as was the norm in the 50s. That story I've kind of kept coming back to a little, but again, probably more about the themes, maybe a little bit about how it's written because of the way that the families wouldn't necessarily talk about it and the ways that it then had to be enacted within the play at the camp. But anyway, that about wraps it up then. This is Hanukkah 5786 and a Jewish short story collection. And thank you so much for going on this ride with me. I hope to be back in the near future to post my monthly author's answer video, so stay tuned for that. In the meantime, I hope all of you who celebrated Hanukkah had a wonderful holiday, a Chag Sameach to you, and thanks so much for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time.